I realized most of my arguments came from clutter. Ever noticed how the smallest things turn into the biggest fights? Like searching for keys when we're already late, or that pile of stuff on the dining table that somehow becomes World War III? What if the real problem isn't what we're arguing about, but what's literally sitting around us? So here's something wild that happened. We started noticing a pattern in our home, and honestly, it was kind of embarrassing once we saw it. Every single argument, every tense moment, every time voices got raised, there was this weird common thread. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about whose turn it was to do the dishes, and it definitely wasn't about any deep relationship issues. Nope, it was clutter. Just stuff everywhere, creating this invisible tension that kept bubbling up in the worst moments. Think about it for a second. We're living in our spaces, going about our day, and there's just this constant background noise of things piling up. That stack of mail nobody opened yet, clothes draped over chairs, random items that don't have a home, so they just float around from surface to surface. It all seems harmless, right? But here's what researchers found. And this is pretty eye-opening. Studies show that clutter actually increases our cortisol levels, which is literally our stress hormone. When scientists measured the stress levels of people in cluttered homes versus organized ones, the difference was huge. People surrounded by mess were way more stressed throughout their entire day, even when they weren't actively thinking about the clutter. The breaking point that changed everything. There was this one specific moment that made everything click into place. We were getting ready to head out for dinner, something we'd been looking forward to all week. Should have been fun and relaxed, right? Instead, it turned into this chaotic scramble. Keys were missing, someone couldn't find their phone, a jacket vanished into thin air, and then it happened. What started as mild frustration just exploded into this full-blown argument about responsibility and consideration, and who knows what else. But here's the thing that hit us afterward. When we'd both calmed down and felt pretty silly about the whole situation, we weren't actually mad at each other, not even a little bit. We were frustrated by our environment, by the chaos we'd been living in without really acknowledging it. The clutter had created this situation where a simple evening out turned into a stress fest, and we took that stress out on each other. That's when it became crystal clear. Our stuff was literally causing problems in our relationship. Psychologists talk about something called decision fatigue, and it connects to this perfectly. Every single item in our space, especially when it's out of place or doesn't belong, requires tiny micro decisions from our brain. Should we move it? Deal with it later? Where does it even go? Multiply that by hundreds of items scattered around, and our brains are just exhausted before we even start our actual day. No wonder we were snapping at each other over nothing. The understanding the clutter conflict connection. So we started digging deeper into this whole thing, and turns out there's actual science backing up what we experienced. The Princeton Neuroscience Institute did research on this, and what they found was fascinating. When our physical environment is cluttered, it actually limits our brain's ability to process information. Visual clutter competes for our attention, making it harder to focus and think clearly. Basically, our brains are trying to process everything in our field of vision, and when there's too much stuff, it's like having 20 browser tabs open at once. Everything slows down, and we get mentally drained without even realizing why. And here's where it gets really interesting for relationships. When we're mentally drained and stressed from our environment, we have way less patience for everything else. Communication gets harder, little annoyances feel bigger, and we're just more reactive. It's not that clutter directly causes arguments, but it sets up this perfect storm where arguments become so much more likely. We're already operating on a shorter fuse because our environment is constantly demanding mental energy. There's also this thing about control and territory that happens unconsciously. When shared spaces become cluttered, it can feel like nobody's taking responsibility, or like personal boundaries are being crossed. That pile of someone's stuff in the living room becomes symbolic of bigger issues, even when it really isn't. We start assigning meaning to the mess, creating narratives about respect and consideration, when really it's just about not having good systems in place. The transformation process. Once we connected these dots, we knew something had to change. But here's what we didn't do, and this is important. We didn't go on some crazy decluttering rampage or try to become minimalist overnight. That approach usually backfires because it's too extreme and not sustainable. Instead, we started small and focused on the spaces where tensions ran highest. First up was the entryway and that whole morning routine area. We got real about what actually needed to live there. Keys got a designated hook, a small tray appeared for phones and wallets, and suddenly those frantic morning searches just stopped happening. It sounds almost too simple, but the impact was immediate. Mornings became calmer, and that set a completely different tone for the entire day. When we weren't starting off stressed and frustrated, we had so much more patience with each other throughout everything else. It's amazing how interconnected it all is. Then came the shared spaces, like the living room and kitchen. These were trickier because they involved both of our stuff and different ideas about what belonged where. We actually had to sit down and talk about it, which felt a bit awkward at first, but ended up being really valuable. We realized we'd never actually discussed how we wanted these spaces to function. Once we got on the same page about purpose and created homes for things, maintaining those spaces became automatic instead of this constant source of friction. The bedroom was probably the biggest game changer, though. Sleep experts are always talking about how your bedroom environment affects sleep quality, and they're absolutely right. When we cleared out the piles of laundry, dealt with the stacks of books and random items, and made it feel more peaceful, we both started sleeping better. And better sleep meant better moods, more patience, and way fewer arguments about absolutely everything. It's amazing how interconnected it all is. What actually changed in our daily life? The differences weren't just about having cleaner spaces, though that was nice too. It was about how we felt moving through our day and interacting with each other. There was this lightness that hadn't been there before. We weren't constantly navigating around stuff or dealing with the mental load of visual chaos. Our home started feeling like a place where we could actually relax, instead of somewhere that demanded constant attention and energy. Communication got easier too, which surprised us at first, until we thought about it more. When we weren't stressed and mentally drained from our environment, we had more capacity for real conversations. We could talk about actual issues when they came up, instead of everything building up and exploding over something unrelated. The clutter had been this smokescreen, hiding what was really going on and making everything feel more complicated than it needed to be. And here's something we didn't expect at all. We started enjoying our space more and actually wanting to spend time there together. Before, we'd find reasons to be out because being home felt overwhelming, even if we couldn't quite put our finger on why. Now our home felt like it was actually on our team, supporting us instead of working against us. That shift in how we related to our physical environment changed how we related to each other in that space. The ongoing journey. We're not perfect at this, and there are definitely still days when things pile up or get a bit chaotic. Life happens, and that's totally normal. But what's different now is we recognize what's happening before it becomes a problem. When we notice tension creeping in, one of the first things we check is whether clutter has been building up. Usually it has. Taking 20 minutes to reset our space often resets our mood and dynamic too. We also figured out that maintenance is way easier than we thought it would be. When everything has a home and we deal with things right away instead of letting them pile up, it takes almost no time. It's the accumulation that becomes overwhelming, not the daily upkeep. That was a big mindset shift for us, realizing that staying on top of it actually requires less energy than letting it build and then dealing with the mess and the stress it causes. The biggest takeaway from this whole experience is that our environment matters so much more than we realized. We think of arguments as being about communication or personality differences or specific issues, and sometimes they are. But often there's this underlying environmental stress that's making everything harder. When we address that foundation, everything else gets easier. It's not a magic solution to every relationship challenge, but it removes one major obstacle that was in our way without us even knowing it. So, if things have been tense lately and arguments seem to pop up over nothing, take a look around. What's your space actually like? Is it supporting the peace you want, or is it quietly working against it? Sometimes the simplest changes create the biggest shifts, and getting clutter under control might just be the relationship advice nobody talks about but everyone needs.